candles at the Fenwick Club had burned low enough that their smoke hung level with the chandelier, a gray ceiling within a ceiling, and beneath it the air smelled of tallow, spilled port, and the particular sourness of men who have stopped pretending to enjoy themselves. It was past midnight on the 14th of April, though no clock in the room had been permitted to strike in the last hour, a courtesy, someone had joked, extended only to men still losing. He had lost a great deal by then. Enough that his cravat had gone damp at the throat, enough that his hand, when it moved to the deck, trembled with the particular steadiness of a man refusing to acknowledge a tremor at all. Across from him sat a figure who had not raised his voice all evening, who had not, in fact, said more than was necessary, to name his stakes and take his winnings. A duke, 34 years of age, dressed in the kind of unornamented black that made other men's velvet look like costume. There was £4,000 already on the table in notes and vowels, and none of it was his to lose again. So he asked for paper. The candle beside him guttered as he wrote, the nib scratching with more confidence than the hand that held it. He did not look up while he formed the words, a wager against the 4,000, one final turn to settle the whole of the night. Nor did he look up when he set down what he was staking against it, not coin, for he had none, but a name, his niece's name. Her hand in marriage, offered across a card table as though she were a parcel of land he had already surveyed and priced. The Duke read the slip once. His face did not change. Those who knew him best would have said later that this was, in itself, the tell, for his face rarely changed at all. He set the paper down, called for the deck to be cut, and turned a single card face up under the candlelight without ceremony, without so much as a pause to let the room understand what it had just witnessed. He won. There was no cheer. Men who gamble seriously do not cheer over a woman's future. They merely note it, the way one notes the fall of grain prices, and return to their glasses. The vowel slip was folded once, witnessed by two members whose names would mean nothing to her, and everything to a magistrate, and placed inside a coat pocket with the same unhurried care one might use to file away a receipt. Somewhere north of London, in a modest house in Hertfordshire, a young woman was asleep, unaware that she had, in the space of a single turned card, become the settled property of a stranger's debt. By morning, she would know everything. What follows is the whole of it, how she came to learn it, what she did with the knowledge, and what it cost the man who had won her to keep what he had not truly wanted to take. Dawn came to Lissenden the color of dishwater, and with it came the sound she would remember for the rest of her life. Not a knock, but the scrape of a boot against the doorstep, twice, as a man too proud to admit he needed the frame to steady himself, tried and failed to find it on the first attempt. She had been awake since 5, as was her habit, mending the hem of a dress that had already been mended twice, and she smelled him before she saw him. Brandy, and beneath it, the sourer note of a night spent somewhere the candles had burned low and long. He came into the kitchen without removing his coat, sat at the table as though the chair had been waiting for him specifically, and looked at the teapot rather than at her. "Pour me a cup," he said, and she did, though it had gone cold an hour before, and neither of them moved to warm it. He did not look up while he told her. That, she would think later, was the detail she kept returning to, not the words themselves, which came out plainly, almost administratively, but the fact that he addressed the account of her own future entirely to the surface of the tea, as a man reads a notice he has already decided not to argue with. A game, a note. A name that meant nothing to her, a duke, he said, as though the title alone should settle any objection she might raise, as though rank were itself a form of payment. £4,000, or her hand, and he had not the £4,000, had never had it, would never have it, and so the matter, he said, was really quite simple. By summer's end, he said, the 3rd of June. She did not ask why the 3rd of June. She would learn later that it was not his date at all, but another man's, a dead father's clause, written years before either of them had a face to put to the debt. For now, she only counted, the way her own father had taught her to count distances across an unmeasured field, breaking a large unknown thing into paces she could hold in her hand. 49 days. She said it aloud, once, testing the number the way one tests ice before a step, and her uncle winced at the sound of it as though she had struck him, though it was his own doing entirely, folded and witnessed, and placed in a coat pocket he had not thought to remove before coming home. He did not apologize. Men rarely do, when the apology would require them to say plainly what they had done. He finished the cold tea, set down the cup with a small, definite click against the saucer, and told her to pack what she could carry, that a duke's household would see to the rest. She did not answer him. She was already, in the quiet arithmetic that would carry her through the weeks ahead, counting backward from the 3rd of June, and forward toward Wiltshire, toward a stranger who did not yet know that the woman he had won intended to arrive at his door, not as a bride, but as a plaintiff. The house they shared had once belonged to grander notions of itself, a narrow brick place on the edge of the market square, with a brass knocker gone green at the edges, and a parlor that still bore, faintly, the shape of better furniture sold off 2 winters past. She had been 19 when her father died, thrown from a hired trap on a surveying commission near Baldock, the ink not yet dry on a field book he never lived to finish. She had finished it herself. It had seemed, at the time, a small act of grief rather than defiance. Sitting at his desk with his brass-cased instruments, translating his cramped hand into fair copy for the client who had paid for the work and did not care who completed it, so long as the figures held. But the figures had held. She had a talent, it turned out, that no one had thought to look for in a surveyor's daughter, an eye for where a number lied, a patience for columns that made grown men's eyes swim. It had earned her, over 2 years, a modest reputation among 3 or 4 local landholders who paid her in small sums and smaller compliments, and it had earned her, from her uncle, a kind of baffled tolerance, as though she were a clever dog that had learned to do sums. She did not resent the poverty itself. She had grown, in the 2 years since her father's death, into a fluency with it, knew exactly how far a shilling could be stretched across a week, how a coat could be turned and returned until it no longer resembled its original cut, how tea could be made twice from the same leaves without complaint. What she could not grow fluent with, what sat in her now like a stone swallowed whole, was the manner of her uncle's telling, not the debt. Debts were common enough. Her father himself had died owing a saddler in Hitchin £4 he had meant to pay come spring. It was that he had spoken of her, in the telling, exactly as he might have spoken of a horse lost at the same table, an asset, unfortunate to part with, but part of the general reckoning of a bad night's play. She had one rule, and she had kept it since her father's coffin was lowered, since the house had begun its slow diminishment around her, since suitors of modest means had come and gone, finding her composure colder than they liked. She would not be disposed of. Not by circumstance, not by kindness disguised as arrangement, not by a man 3 counties distant who had, by all report, no more asked for her than she had asked for him. She packed her father's satchel first, before any dress. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, his instruments, folded beneath them, his pocket Bible, its spine soft with handling. Whatever waited in Wiltshire, she would arrive as his daughter, not her uncle's stake. She asked to see it before she asked anything else, not the sum, which her uncle repeated, as though repetition might soften it, but the paper itself, the actual object that had made her a line item in another man's ledger. He resisted this with the particular helplessness of a man who had already lost the argument and knew it. When she did not lower her eyes, he produced it from his coat, creased twice, ink gone slightly brown, at the fold where it had rubbed against his pocket watch on the ride home. She read it standing, by the window, where the morning light was thin but sufficient. Received of the Duke of Ashworth the sum of £4,000, forfeit by the undersigned at cards, this 14th night of April, 1821, to be discharged by the undersigned's payment in full, or in default thereof, by the hand in marriage of Miss S. Kendrick, given freely by her natural guardian. Given freely. She read the phrase 3 times, as if rereading might alter its authorship, and noted, with the same cool attention her father had once brought to a boundary dispute, the two names appended beneath as witnesses, a Mr. Colworth and a Mr. Teal, gentlemen she had never met, who had signed their names to the disposal of hers as they might have signed a wine bill. "You cannot go to him," her uncle said, when she told him what she meant to do. His voice had climbed past pleading into something closer to fright. "A woman does not arrive at a duke's door unasked. It is not done." "Neither," she said, folding the note along its existing crease and setting it upon the table between them, "is this." He argued the distance. Wiltshire, 3 days by coach and cart, money they did not have for the fare. He argued propriety, then argued it again more loudly when the first argument failed to move her. He invoked her father's memory in a manner that made her go very still, for it was not his to invoke, and she told him so, quietly, in a voice that ended the conversation more thoroughly than shouting could have. He did not raise the matter again that evening, though she heard him afterward through the thin wall, pacing, muttering sums to himself, as though the debt might be reasoned smaller by will alone. She counted, that night by candle, the way her father had taught her to count a survey, not in feelings but in fixed points. The wager was struck on the 14th of April. She had learned of it on the 15th. If the note itself carried no date by which the marriage must be completed, she had since heard enough, in her uncle's frightened asides, to understand that the Duke's own affairs pressed toward some early June reckoning of his own. 46 days, by her reckoning, remained before that unnamed date arrived and made the question moot by default rather than by decision. She would not let it be decided by default. She began, before she slept, to fold what little she owned into shapes small enough to travel. She left before her uncle woke, on the morning of the 20th, with 2 shillings sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and her father's satchel across her body, like a soldier's kit. The coach to Wiltshire ran only twice a week from the Crossroads Inn, and she paid for the outside seat because it was cheaper, and because the inside was already full of a haberdasher's wife who eyed her mud-hemmed coat with the particular contempt of a woman who had once been poor and meant never to be reminded of it. The rain began somewhere past Reading and did not stop for 2 days. It came sideways under the brim of her bonnet, found the seams of her father's old coat and turned them cold, and settled into a permanent damp that no amount of shifting could dislodge. She had brought bread and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in a handkerchief, and on the second night, at a coaching inn whose name she did not trouble to learn, she shared it with an old drover traveling to Salisbury, who broke his own bread in return, and told her, without being asked, that the roads west of Marlborough were the worst in England, and had been since before the old king lost his wits. It was the drover who first spoke the Duke's name to her, not knowing what it meant to her to hear it spoken by a stranger. He had delivered cattle once to the Ashworth estate, he said, some 6 years past, and had been paid to the shilling and not a farthing more, though the steward had tried to short-change him and been overruled by the Duke himself, who had come out into the yard in his shirt-sleeves to settle it. A hard man, the drover said, chewing. Fair, but hard, counted everything. Wept at his wife's grave for exactly as long as decency required, and not a moment longer, or so the servants said, though servants said many things that were more wish than truth. Sophia listened and said little, turning the cheese in her fingers, watching rain run down the window glass in threads that caught the inn's single candle and scattered it into small broken lights. She thought of a man who counted everything, who wept for exactly as long as decency required, and wondered whether such a man would receive her at all, or have her turned away at the gate by some steward, instructed to admit no strangers, particularly not muddied ones, arriving on foot from the lodge, with a note in his own hand, for £4,000, folded against her ribs like a wound. By the 3rd day the coach had emptied of all but herself and a farmer's boy asleep against the window, and the country had changed around her, the hedgerows lower, the fields opening into a flatness broken by chalk downs pale as old bone under the clearing sky. She began, without quite meaning to rehearse what she would say when she stood before him, and found that every version ended the same way, not with pleading, but with the note laid flat upon a table, and her own voice asking him, plainly, to look at it. The gates of Ashworth Hall stood open, which she had not expected, and unguarded, which she understood only later to be a kind of tragedy rather than a courtesy. She had walked the last mile from where the coach set her down, her boots gone through at one heel, her father's satchel heavy across her shoulder, and the note itself pressed flat against her ribs beneath her bodice, as though it might, given the chance, work its way loose and flutter off across the wet grass, and settle the whole matter by simply disappearing. The house, when it came into view past the lime avenue, was not the house she had pictured on the coach. She had imagined something gleaming, ungenerous with light, the kind of place that announced its owner's consequence before he ever spoke a word. Instead, she saw a roofline missing slate in 2 places, ivy grown thick and unchecked along the east wing, a fountain in the forecourt gone dry and furred with moss at its lip. 43 days, she thought, though she did not yet know to call it that, only that whatever deadline governed this house, it did not appear to govern its guttering. The man who opened the door to her was older than she expected, silver at the temples, in a coat brushed so carefully it seemed an act of penance. He looked at her, at the mud stiffening along her hem, at the satchel, at her face, which she had schooled on the walk up the avenue, into something she hoped resembled composure, and which felt, from the inside, closer to held breath, and he did not immediately speak. "I have come to see the Duke," she said. "My name is of no consequence until he hears it." It was, she would reflect afterward, exactly the wrong thing, and exactly the right thing to say, and she watched it land somewhere behind the butler's careful eyes. "Miss," he said, "His Grace does not receive callers without notice." "I have not come to call. I have come to settle a debt." He hesitated then, she saw it, the smallest failure of his training, a half-second in which the door neither opened wider nor began to close. And she understood that whatever composure she had managed to carry up that long avenue had bought her exactly this, one man's uncertainty, held open like a door on a single hinge. "Wait here," he said at last, and did not say it unkindly. She stood on the step in the thin morning light, listening to a dog bark somewhere behind the house, to a rook complaining in the elms, to her own heartbeat, which she noted with some detachment was louder than either. She did not sit. She did not smooth her hair or her skirts, having decided somewhere on the 3rd day of travel that dishevelment was, in its own way, a form of honesty she would not apologize for. She simply waited, counting, though she would not have called it counting, the seconds it took for a great house to decide whether a muddied, penniless woman with a debt in her pocket was worth admitting at all. The door, when it opened again, opened only halfway, and it was the Duke himself who stood in the gap, not the butler who had left her on the step. He was dressed as though for business rather than for callers. No coat, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, ink still fresh enough on his fingers that she could smell it, sharp and metallic, mingling with the wood smoke drifting from somewhere within. He looked at her, the way a man looks at a column of figures that will not sum correctly no matter how many times he adds them. "You had better come in," he said, "before the servants make a story of you standing in the drive." He led her not to a drawing room, but to his study, a chamber of dark shelves and colder light, where a ledger lay open on the desk beside a paperweight shaped like a hound. He did not offer her a chair. She noticed this, filed it away with the same detachment she had given her own heartbeat on the step, and remained standing, her father's satchel still slung across her body like a soldier's kit. "I am given to understand," she said, "that my uncle has made free with what was never his to wager." "Your uncle," the Duke said, "signed a paper before witnesses. I did not seek this, but it is signed, and I do not tear up what is signed." He said it without heat, the way a man reads aloud a clause he has read 100 times before, and it was this very absence of cruelty that struck her hardest, that he could say such a thing and believe himself merely honest. "Then you mean to hold me to it?" "I mean," he said, "that the matter is settled, whatever your feelings on it. You need not trouble yourself with the particulars." The words landed with the flat precision of a closing account, and she felt something in her chest draw tight, and then, strangely, still. She had come 3 days across bad roads with mud to her knees and her father's Bible pressed against her ribs, rehearsing arguments of law and decency, And here was the whole of his answer: that her feelings were a particular she need not trouble herself with. "I will not," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake, though her hands, folded before her, did, be handed, from one man's ledger into another's account book. "My uncle sold what was not his. You have bought nothing, sir, but the appearance of a wife, and I will not marry a man who has purchased me, as he might a horse at Tattersall's, examined for soundness, and led home on a rope." The silence that followed had a texture to it, like the pause before a clock strikes, and she watched something move behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, but stood very close to the border between the two, waiting, as she was, to see which side it would fall upon. He did not answer at once. He crossed instead to the window, where the afternoon light lay thin and gray across the carpet, and stood with his back to her in a posture she would come to recognize, though she did not yet know it, as the shape he made when a thing cost him more than he intended to show. When he spoke, it was not to her question directly, but around it, the way a man circles a wound before he touches it. "There is a clause in my father's will," he said, "concerning the disposition of this estate. I am required to marry before the 3rd of June, or it passes from me to a cousin I have met perhaps 4 times in my life, a man who keeps his hounds better fed than his tenants." He turned then, and she saw that his face had lost none of its composure, but something underneath the composure had shifted, as ice shifts before it cracks, without sound, without warning. "I did not sit down to that game intending to win a wife. I sat down because I had 6 weeks left and no bride, and your uncle offered me, in his desperation, a solution that required nothing of me but a signature and a sum I could well afford. It seemed, at the time, a transaction like any other." She heard the counting in his voice before she understood it, the particular flatness of a man who has done arithmetic so often it no longer feels like arithmetic, only weather, only the fact of the season closing in. 6 weeks. She did the sum herself, quickly, the way her father had taught her to check a surveyor's chain against a known distance. Today, the 22nd of April, and so it left him, she nearly said it aloud, 42 days. "Then you are not free either," she said, and it was not quite a question. "No," he said, and offered nothing further, as though the word alone were confession enough, and any more would be indecent. She looked at him with the same attention she might have given a boundary stone half sunk in mud, something whose true position could not be trusted by its appearance alone. He had spoken of her as a particular, a transaction, an appearance of a wife, and she had taken it as coldness. But a man does not confess the shape of his own trap to a stranger unless the trap has begun, in some private hour, to gall him. She did not soften toward him. She was too tired and too far from home, and too recently made furious to soften, but she filed the fact away as she filed all facts, in the ledger she kept behind her eyes, beside the mud on her boots and the ache in her shoulders from 3 days of bad roads, that he, too, was being spent by people who had never once asked his leave. It was into this silence that the dowager entered, without knocking, as she seemed to enter every room in the house, as though the walls belonged to her more thoroughly than to anyone presently occupying them. She wore gray that evening, the gray of pigeon feathers, and she looked between them with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has arrived at the exact moment she intended to arrive, and not a moment sooner. "You will stay the week," she said to the young woman, in the tone of one remarking on the weather. "Your Grace, I could not." "You could, and you shall, and we will not discuss it as though it were a scandal, because it is not one. You are a guest, nothing more." She said the last 2 words with a small, precise emphasis, as if setting down a teacup exactly upon its ring. "Your uncle will be written to. Terms, if there are to be terms at all, will be settled by correspondence, at a civilized distance, and in the meantime you will eat something that is not inbred, and sleep somewhere the rain cannot find you." The young woman looked toward him, expecting, she hardly knew what. Confirmation, perhaps, or rescue from the offer. He gave neither. He only inclined his head, the smallest fraction, as though the matter had already been decided by someone with more authority than either of them possessed, which, in that house, was precisely the case. She might have refused. She turned the refusal over in her mind, as she had turned over every fact that week, testing its weight, its honesty. Pride urged her toward the road at once, toward the mail coach, toward the appearance of having wanted nothing from this house but the tearing of a piece of paper. But beneath the pride was arithmetic, cold and unromantic. Her uncle's debts were not resolved by her leaving in a temper, and a letter traveling by correspondence, however civilized, would take days she could not spend twice. To stay was not surrender. It was the only ledger entry that made sense. "A week, then," she said, "as a guest." "As a guest," the dowager agreed, already moving toward the door, already speaking of linens and the room at the end of the east corridor that caught the morning sun, as though the negotiation had never required negotiating at all. He said nothing more before she left the hall, only watched her go with an attention he did not trouble to disguise, and she felt it on her back the way one feels weather changing before it arrives. Not unpleasant, only undeniable. Alone in the room they had given her, she took out her father's Bible and turned it in her hands without opening it, and did not write in her small traveling ledger that night, though she had written in it every night since London. 42 days remained for him. She did not yet know how many remained for her, only that she had chosen, for the first time since the 15th of April, the shape of her own next hour. Sleep, when it came shallow, and left her again before 4. The house at that hour had a different character than it wore by day. Not unfriendly, only unwatched, the way a face is unwatched in the moment before it composes itself for company. She dressed without calling for anyone, because she had never in her life called for anyone to help her dress, and went down the east corridor to see whether the son the dowager had promised was, in fact, a thing that corridor received, or only a thing said to make a guest feel chosen. It was a door, ajar, that stopped her. Not her own door, a room she had not been shown, with a long table and ledgers stacked in a manner that told her at once no one who loved order had stacked them. One lay open upon a chair as though set down mid-thought and never returned to, a column of figures in a steward's cramped hand, drainage costs for the lower tenant fields, dated the previous autumn. She should not have looked. She told herself this, even as she was already looking, the old habit rising in her before permission could catch up to it, her father's habit, taught over a surveyor's table by candlelight, that a column of numbers left crooked was a wound left open, and a person who could set it right, and did not, was committing a small daily cruelty against whoever came after. The figures did not sum, not by a shilling here or there, which might have been a tired clerk's error, but by an amount too tidy to be careless. The same difference, near enough, repeated across 3 separate months, as though someone had found a seam in the account and returned to it the way a tongue returns to a loose tooth. She had no pencil of her own to hand, but there was one on the table, worn short, and before she had decided to use it she had already drawn a thin line beneath the wrong total and written, in a hand smaller and neater than the steward's, the correct sum beside it. She did not sign it. She told herself this was restraint, and knew, even as she thought it, that it was something nearer to a confession, that she could not pass a wrong number sleeping in a book without waking it, whatever house it happened to belong to, whatever days remained to her as a guest in it. She closed the ledger to where it had lain, not quite as it had been, and left the room before the corridor's promised sun had troubled itself to rise. Walking back, she counted without meaning to. 42 days for him, she reminded herself, and did not finish the other sum, the one that had no fixed date at the end of it, only a week that might become a fortnight, or nothing at all. Behind her, in the room she had left, the penciled correction waited to be found by someone who would wonder, without yet asking her, whose hand had thought to mend what no one else had noticed was broken. The steward found the correction on the 3rd morning after, when the accounts were brought to him as they always were, folded once and set upon the corner of his desk by a maid who did not know to look for anything amiss. He unfolded the page in the ordinary way, with the ordinary impatience of a man who expected the world to continue agreeing with him, and then he did not move for the space of perhaps 10 seconds, long enough that the maid, lingering in the doorway with a coal scuttle, remembered it afterward and mentioned it to no one but the cook, who mentioned it to no one at all, so that the only record of it lived in two servants' memories and nowhere on paper. He did not call for the housekeeper, nor ask which hand had written the neat correction beneath his own. He closed the ledger with more care than the moment seemed to require. As a man closes a door he does not wish to be heard closing, and when the butler entered a quarter-hour later to inquire after the drainage accounts for the eastern fields, a matter of ordinary business, nothing pointed in it. The steward's answer came a beat too quickly, and pitched a note higher than the question warranted. "All in order," he said, "as they have always been." The butler, who had served the house for 26 years, and had learned in that time to read a man's hands as readily as his face, noticed that the steward's own hands, folded upon the ledger's cover, were not still. He noticed, too, that the steward did not offer the book for inspection, though it had been his habit, in better days, to lay his accounts open before anyone who asked, as a man displays a clean conscience for the pleasure of it. The butler said nothing of what he noticed. He had built a long career upon saying nothing of what he noticed, and had found it served the house better than speech ever had. But he began, from that morning, to watch the steward, as he had not troubled himself to watch him before, not with suspicion declared, for he was not a man given to declarations, but with the patient, unhurried attention of a servant who has decided a thing bears watching and intends to watch it for as long as it takes. He observed which rooms the steward entered, and at what hours. He observed that the steward had begun locking the estate office at night, a precaution he had never before thought necessary in a house where the family itself did not trouble to lock its doors. 38 days remained until the 3rd of June, and the butler, counting them now for reasons of his own that had little to do with weddings, found that he had begun to count them differently than before, not only as the measure of his master's freedom, but as the length of rope a dishonest man might yet be given to hang himself upon, if no one moved to shorten it. The summons came at 11 in the morning, delivered by the butler himself, who said only that the Duke wished to see her in the library, and who did not say what for, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he had guessed. She came with the ledgers under her arm, 3 of them, bound in the cracked leather her father had taught her to recognize as good calfskin gone dry from neglect. She had not been asked to bring them. She brought them anyway, because she had learned long ago that a woman summoned to explain herself did better to arrive with proof than with apology. He was standing at the window when she entered, his back to the room, and he did not turn at once. "The pencil mark," he said. "The correction to the tenant rents." He would like to know by what authority she had altered a household record that was not hers to alter. She set the ledgers on the desk, one beside the other, and opened the first to a page she had marked with a strip of paper the previous evening. "By the authority of arithmetic," she said, "and nothing more grand than that." He turned then. She did not wait for him to speak again, but drew his attention with her finger to a column of figures. The cost of drainage works on the eastern tenant lands, entered in the steward's own hand, for the autumn of 1818. She read the sum aloud, then she turned to the second ledger, the same works, the same fields, entered the following spring, by a different clerk under the steward's direction, at a cost nearly double the first. She turned to the third. A third entry, the same drainage, the same acreage, dated the previous autumn, at a sum higher still, though no new trenching had been recorded, no new tile laid, nothing in the tenant complaints to suggest the land required a third correction of the same defect. She did not accuse. She only laid the numbers before him and let them speak. As her father had taught her, figures would always speak plainly if a man had the patience to let them. 3 years, she said. The same fields, the same fault, growing costlier each time it is mended, though it is never mended. Either your steward is the worst drainer of land in Wiltshire, or he has found a use for water that has nothing to do with drying it. He said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the ledgers, and then at her, with an expression she could not entirely name. Not affront, though she had half expected affront, and not gratitude either, though she had not expected that at all. Something quieter than either. the look of a man recalculating a sum he had thought long settled. 38 days, he said at last, though not to her. To himself, it seemed, or to the window, or to some private accounting he kept that she had not yet been shown the whole of. She did not ask what he meant by it. She only closed the third ledger and waited, as she had learned to wait for men who required a moment before they could bring themselves to say what the figures had already told them. By morning, the library had become a kind of country of its own, bordered by ledger and lamplight, its seasons measured not in weather, but in the level of tea gone cold in 2 cups that no one troubled to refill. He came down before the household stirred, as was his habit, and found she was already there, sleeves turned back, a smear of ink drying blue-black along the side of her hand, where she had rested it too long against a wet entry. She did not look up when he entered. She had learned, in 5 days, that he preferred to be permitted into a room rather than announced into it, and she extended him that same courtesy now, the courtesy of not making an occasion of his arrival. They worked without much speech at first, dividing the years between them, she taking the earlier drainage accounts, he the later, cross-referencing sums that refused, stubbornly, to agree with themselves. The candle between them burned to a stub and was replaced, and burned to a stub again. 35 days, then 34, marked not aloud, but in the small private arithmetic. She suspected he performed each morning before he had even dressed, the way another man might say his prayers. She discovered he took his tea black and let it go cold without seeming to notice, and once, without deciding to, she rose and poured him a fresh cup, setting it at his elbow the way she had once set cups at her father's elbow over drainage surveys long before either of them had learned what ruin cost. He glanced at it. He did not thank her in words, but the following morning there were 2 clean cups already laid upon the table when she arrived, and she understood this for what it was, not gallantry, which he seemed constitutionally unable to perform, but attention, which she suspected he trusted rather more. They spoke, when they spoke at all, of figures, of a culvert rerouted without record, of stone billed for and never delivered, of a name that appeared too often in the steward's hand and too rarely in the tenants' accounts of their own harvests. He listened to her the way she imagined he listened to very little else, without the courtesy of a man being patient and with the attention of a man being instructed. Once, reaching for the same ledger at the same moment, their hands met over the spine of it, ink to ink, and both withdrew with an equal, matching swiftness, as though the contact had cost them something they had not budgeted to spend. 33 days remained, she noted, marking it against her father's old habit of dating every page he touched, though she told no one she kept such a count, and did not yet know that he kept one too, nor how much nearer his ran to its ruin than hers. It was the bluntness that undid him, in the end, not tears which he had armor against, having watched a great many women deploy them to great effect over the years, but the plain, surveyor's daughter directness with which she set down her pen one gray afternoon and asked why a man who could recite the tonnage of every stone quarried on his land in the last decade could not say why his own household treated marriage as a transaction to be closed, rather than a matter of any feeling whatsoever. He did not answer at once. He had the look, she thought, of a man totaling a sum he had avoided totaling for some time, unwilling to be short in his accounts before a witness. "My wife," he said finally, "died in childbed. 3 years this November." He said it the way he might report a drainage failure, factually, with the date attached, as though precision were the only mercy available to him. The child did not live either, if that wants saying. She said nothing. She had learned, in her weeks in that house, that silence given generously was worth more to him than sympathy offered cheaply, and she offered it now, letting the fire answer for her. "Since then," he continued, "I have been a title first, and, on good days, a man second. My aunt arranges, my cousin calculates. Your uncle wagered." A faint, humorless motion crossed his mouth. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one that had once lived there and moved out. "I confess I had begun to think there was no other way to be regarded." "You are regarded that way," she said, "because you have permitted it 34 years running. It is not the same as being made to." He looked at her then, with something she could not immediately name. Not affront, though she had half expected it, but a kind of startled gratitude, as a man might regard a ledger column that had finally, after long searching, been made to balance. "You are remarkably ungentle for a guest," he said. "I was raised by a man who measured land for his bread. He did not have the leisure to be gentle with numbers that would not add. I find I have inherited the habit." He did not answer that directly, only returned to the ledger between them, though she noticed a great many things she did not speak of, that his hand, when it next crossed the page, did not withdraw quite so swiftly as before. She did not ask further about the wife, nor the child, though the dates stayed with her the way dates always did, filed beside the other figures she kept without instruction. 33 days, now 32, a note worth £4,000, a birthday in June she had not been told the significance of, and had begun, nonetheless, to suspect. She thought of her father's Bible, packed still in her satchel, and of the small, private arithmetic a person performs when grief has taught them that time is the one ledger no one is permitted to falsify. The smell of smoke reached her before the sound of it did, a thin, acrid thread finding its way beneath the estate-room door on the evening of the 28th day, when she had gone looking for a ledger the steward had promised and not delivered. She followed it as she had followed every column that summer, without hurry, without announcement, and found him kneeling before the hearth with a fistful of paper already curling black at the edges, his face lit orange and unsteady. He did not startle when the door opened. He had the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he will say if caught, and says it before he is asked. "Old accounts," he told her. "Nothing that concerns the house." She did not raise her voice, nor did she step further into the room than was necessary to be heard. "Then you will not mind if I take what remains to the Duke unread." He minded. It showed in the way his hand closed briefly around the last unburned sheet before he thought better of holding it against her, and let it fall, and she lifted it from the ash-dusted floor with the same unhurried care she gave to any surveyor's page that had come to her damaged, smoothing the singed corner, angling it toward the candle to read what the fire had not yet taken. It was not much. A single column, half a name, a sum broken off mid-figure, but she had spent 3 weeks with the drainage accounts by then, had copied the older tenant rolls in her own hand for want of anything better to occupy the evenings, and the numbers that remained were enough, set beside what she already carried in memory, to tell her which entries were missing and what they ought to have said. She did not need the burned pages to be whole. She needed only to know where the false ones diverged from the true, and she had known that for some days, though she had said nothing, waiting, she recognized the habit in herself only as she practiced it, to be certain before she spoke. She sat that same night at the estate-room desk, by a candle she did not ask permission to burn low, and reconstructed from the older ledgers and her own recollection the figures the steward had meant to destroy, the drainage costs inflated by nearly a third across 2 winters, the difference pocketed in sums small enough, individually, to escape a careless eye, and large enough together to matter to a man counting his remaining days as closely as his remaining pounds. By morning she had a fair copy, and the singed original pressed flat beneath her father's Bible for safekeeping, and a quiet, settled certainty that what she had found would need to be laid before the one man in the house with the standing to act on it, before the steward found nerve enough, or reason enough, to attempt the fire a second time. The morning she brought both papers to him, the frost had not yet lifted from the east lawn, and she found him already at his desk, as though he too had counted the hours until she might come. He read the fair copy first, then the singed original, his face giving nothing away until he reached the sum at the bottom, underlined twice in her own economical hand, £412, taken across 2 winters, in amounts too small to be called theft by a careless man, and too large to be called anything else by an honest one. He did not raise his voice when the steward was brought in. That, she would later think, was the whole of his cruelty, and the whole of his mercy at once. He simply set the 2 ledgers side by side upon the desk, and asked the man to account for the difference between them, and let the silence that followed do what shouting never could. The steward's protests thinned within a minute into nothing at all. By noon, his belongings were gone from the estate cottage, and by evening, his name had already begun to disappear from the tenants' talk, the way names do when a household decides, collectively and without discussion, to stop speaking them. It was afterward, in the narrow hour between the steward's departure and the ringing of the dinner bell, that he found her still in the estate room, blotting the last of the fair copy dry. "I have had stewards audited before," he said. "Never uncovered." She did not look up from the page. "You had not had occasion to look closely, Your Grace. Most men in your position are not made to." "No," he agreed, "most are not." And then, in a voice she had not yet heard from him, unguarded, without the careful distance he kept even in kindness, he added, "I am obliged to you. More than the sum warrants." She met his eyes then, briefly, and said nothing, because there was nothing that would not diminish it by being spoken aloud, and she had learned long ago that gratitude offered plainly deserved to be received the same way. Below stairs, the story traveled faster than either of them intended. The housekeeper repeated it twice at supper with visible relish. The youngest footman, who had disliked the steward on instinct for a year without knowing why, declared himself vindicated. And the butler, who had served the house for 26 years and had watched 2 duchesses come and go without once altering the formality of his address, found himself, 3 days later, holding the door for her with a bow some degree deeper than strict duty required, and saying, "Miss Kendrick," in a tone that had shed something of its former caution, as though he had reappraised her, the way a man reappraises a bridge he has crossed 100 times, and only now notices was built to bear far more weight than it was ever asked to carry. 19 days remained before the 3rd of June, and though no one in the house spoke the number aloud, she had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping the count herself. The satchel had been left, by some small oversight of the maid who tended the guest wing, upon the window seat rather than in the wardrobe, and it was there he found it on his way to breakfast, cracked leather, a brass buckle gone green at the edges, and beside it a Bible bound in calf, so worn the gilt lettering had faded to a suggestion rather than a word. He did not open either. He stood over them the way a man stands over a grave he has not been invited to visit, and when she came upon him there, he did not step back as though caught, only said, "Your father's." "Yes." "A surveyor." 31 years. Roads, mostly. Boundary disputes. Once a canal that was never built. She came further into the room, and something in her voice, ordinarily so guarded, loosened at the edges, the way ice loosens before it breaks rather than melts. "He died on a road survey, in November, in the rain." The ground had gone soft where they were measuring a culvert, and the bank gave way beneath him. They found his chain and his notebook before they found him. He was quiet, in the particular way that meant he was choosing his next words with more care than the moment strictly required. "How old were you?" 19. "And the notebook?" "I have it still. Not that one. His last one. They never recovered. But the ones before. Numbers mostly. Elevations. Rain. Gauges. Mostly. The kind of thing no one reads twice, and yet I have read them 100 times." He said nothing to that, only looked at the calf-bound Bible a moment longer, as if it were a boundary marker he had not been trained to read, and then the two of them stood together in the library in a silence that had, for the first time, nothing accusatory in it. It did not last the day. The letter came that afternoon, carried up from the village on a horse ridden harder than the roads required, and the butler brought it to him on a silver tray, as though it were any other correspondence, though his face, schooled these 26 years to give nothing away, gave something away now. The hand on the outside was her uncle's. She recognized it before he had broken the seal, that same cramped, hurrying script that had once informed her, over a cold breakfast, that her future had been settled without her. He read it standing, and read it again seated, which she had come to understand was his particular tell, the closest he came to alarm. Her uncle had heard nothing, no word of settlement, no word of release, only silence from the hall for 6 weeks, and silence, to a man drowning in debts of his own making, was not mercy, but delay, and delay was not to be trusted. He was coming himself. He named the date plainly, as though naming it made it a fact rather than a threat, the 30th of May. He would come for the £4,000, or he would come for the marriage, whichever the Duke found more convenient to arrange, and he trusted his Grace would have one or the other ready, as a gentleman kept his obligations. 4 days before your birthday, she said, when he had told her the substance of it, not the whole letter, though she suspected she had guessed the rest. 4 days, he agreed. She did not ask what he meant to do, and he did not offer it, though she noticed. She had learned to notice such things about him, the way one learns the creak of a particular stair, that he went that evening not to his study, but to the estate office, where the drainage ledgers still lay open on the steward's old desk, and stayed there past the hour the household went dark, a single candle burning in the window like a countdown kept by hand rather than clock. 34 days had become 4. She lay awake counting them anyway, though counting had never once slowed a single one of them down. She found him there near midnight. The candle burned down to a stub no thicker than a quill, and instead of retreating as she had done on other nights, she crossed the room and set her own candle beside his, so that the light doubled, and the ledgers threw 2 shadows instead of 1. He did not send her away. He had stopped, some weeks past, pretending that he could. What she saw on the desk was not the drainage accounts. It was a bundle of letters, thin foreign paper, postmarked from a parish in the north of Yorkshire, and another in the Scottish borders, tied with the kind of plain string a solicitor uses when he does not wish to be remembered for his ribbon. She did not ask permission before she read the topmost. He did not stop her. The letters concerned a search, a quiet, patient, expensively patient search for a man descended in an unbroken line from his grandfather's younger brother, a line thought extinguished 60 years before in a dispute over a Scottish living, but which a solicitor of discretion had traced, over 11 months, and at a cost Bertram had never entered in any ledger she had been permitted to see, to a schoolmaster of good character and legitimate birth, presently unaware that he stood one confirmation away from becoming heir to a trust he had never heard named. 16 days ago, he said when she looked up at him, the second confirmation arrived. He said it the way he said most things that cost him something, evenly, as a man reads a surveyor's figure aloud rather than a confession. The trust required only a legitimate line, not a marriage. His father, in his carefulness, had left that door unlocked without ever meaning it as mercy. Bertram had spent the better part of a year walking through it in secret, not because he feared marriage itself, she understood now, but because he would not be handed a wife the way he had once been handed a title, by other men's arithmetic, in a room he had not chosen to enter. "You might have told me," she said, not unkindly. "I did not know, until 16 days ago, that it would come to anything." He looked at the letters rather than at her. A man does not like to offer hope he cannot yet stand behind. She thought of the wager still folded in her father's satchel, and of how little difference, in the end, there was between a debt owed and a hope not yet confirmed. Both of them promises a person carried privately, afraid to name aloud before they were certain. Outside, the first gray edge of morning was finding the window, and somewhere beyond the park, the church clock in the village began, faintly, to strike the hour, as if counting along with them both toward the 4th day still to come. The 30th of May arrived with a heat that had no business in an English spring, and the drive to the hall lay pale with dust that had not seen rain in a week. He came at 4 in the afternoon, in a hired gig that had cost him more than he could afford, and he came alone, which the butler would later say was the first wrong note in the whole business. A man certain of his claim does not arrive without a witness to admire it. He was shown into the front hall rather than a drawing room, a small deliberateness that he did not appear to notice. He mopped his brow with a handkerchief gone gray at its folds, twice, then a third time, though the hall itself was cool with stone and shadow. The light came through the tall window in a single flat bar, gold turning to amber, as the afternoon leaned toward evening, and it fell across the silver tray on the hall table where the folded note lay waiting, not hidden, not offered, simply present, the way a fact is present before anyone has agreed to acknowledge it. He asked for the sum first, as though the sum were the kinder request. £4,000, he said, or the arrangement stands as written, and he said it looking not at the man before him but at the tray, at the paper, as if the note itself might be persuaded to speak in his defense. His voice did not shout. It had the thin, careful pitch of a man who has rehearsed a demand so many times in his own head that saying it aloud feels almost anticlimactic. She stood at the foot of the stair, her hand resting on the newel post, the way one steadies oneself before water. She did not speak first. She had learned, these 16 days, that silence held its own arithmetic, and that a room would often do her arguing for her if she let it run its course. The butler did not move to take the man's hat. That too was a decision, though a small one, and it went unremarked by everyone but the woman near the stair, who noted it the way she noted most things now, filing it away without comment, as one files a discrepancy in a ledger before the sum is proven wrong. 4 days remained until the 3rd of June, and every person in that hall seemed, in that moment, to be counting them differently. The uncle counting toward a payment he did not have, the master of the house counting toward a deadline he had not yet spoken of aloud to the one person it most concerned, and she herself counting, quietly, toward whichever ending would let her stop counting at all. He crossed the hall without hurry, and that, more than anything, unsettled the uncle, who had come prepared for shouting, for negotiation, for the particular theater of men who believe volume is leverage. Instead, the master of the house drew the folded paper from his breast pocket, with the unhurried care of a man retrieving a bill he intends to pay in full, and he opened it there, in the cold light falling through the fanlight above the door, so that the ink showed plainly to everyone present. He read it aloud, not quickly, not for effect, but the way a man reads a thing he wishes to be finished reading forever. £4,000, he said, or the hand of Miss S. Kendrick, signed, witnessed, dated the 14th of April. He looked up. I have read it a great many times these past weeks. I confess, I no longer find it interesting. The uncle's mouth opened on some rehearsed line about honor among gentlemen, about debts owed being debts paid, but the words did not survive contact with the room. You will not be paid, the master of the house said, because there is nothing left to purchase. The trust that governed this house required a marriage by the 3rd of June, or the whole of it, to pass from my hand to my cousin's. That requirement no longer stands. I have spent 5 months funding a search you knew nothing of, for an heir with a truer claim than either my cousin or myself, a claim proven, recorded, and accepted by the trustees 11 days ago. He let that settle, the way a man lets sediment settle before pouring. The estate does not need my marriage to survive. It never needed hers. Near the stair, she felt the words arrive slightly behind their meaning, the way distant thunder arrives after the flash that made it. First the fact, then, a breath later, the understanding of what the fact undid. He tore the paper in half. He did it plainly, without flourish, the way one tears a bill already settled, and the sound of it, a small dry sound, no louder than a page turning, seemed to fill the hall more completely than any shout could have done. The uncle's hand rose, too late, toward the pieces, and stopped, because there was nothing left worth reaching for. Your niece, the master of the house said, owes you nothing. She never did. He folded the torn halves together, once, and did not offer them to anyone. You will leave this house today. You will not return to it. The butler, at last, moved, not toward the hat, but toward the door, holding it open with the particular finality of a man closing a ledger. She did not step forward. She only watched the uncle's shoulders find their true, diminished shape, and understood, with the clarity of a woman finally permitted to stop counting one thing, that a different reckoning had only just begun. The uncle went, and the going of him was smaller than the wager had been, smaller even than the loss. A man walking out into a Wiltshire morning with his coat buttoned wrong and his hat held rather than worn, as though he had forgotten which gestures belonged to a person of consequence and which to a person merely tolerated. No one watched him from the windows. That, too, seemed a kind of mercy, though she was not certain, afterward, whether it had been granted for his sake or simply because no one in that house had the appetite left to watch. What came after was not charity, and he was careful, the master of the house was careful, to see that it should not resemble charity even in the smallest particular. A letter was written, brief and without warmth, to a land agent near Devizes who managed drainage disputes and tenant leases for 3 parishes and had, for some years, needed a man capable, with correspondence, and unafraid of ledgers. The wages offered were modest, the hours were long, no mention was made, in the letter or afterward, of debts owed or notes torn. The arrangement stood on its own feet, as a position a man might earn or lose by his own conduct, and nothing more. He took it, because there was nothing else left to take, and because 11 weeks of watching his own name unravel in front of witnesses had taught him, finally, the difference between a debt forgiven and a debt simply no longer his to pay. She did not go with him. She had thought, in the strange quiet of the days just after, that gratitude alone might carry her back to the cottage at once, that freedom, once granted, ought to be spent immediately, the way a coin burns in a poor man's pocket until it is gone. But she found instead that she wanted 3 days, 3 days to walk the flooded fields once more, with the steward's false figures folded in her father's satchel, 3 days to finish what the ledgers had begun, 3 days in which no one asked anything of her at all. The deadline, the 3rd of June, stood 4 days off when the note was torn, and she let 3 of those 4 pass in ordinary work, mending, walking, sitting with the dowager over cold tea that no one troubled to replace, as though the date carried no particular weight for her, though she counted it still, privately, the way one counts a bruise by pressing it. On the 3rd day, she packed the satchel herself, refused the carriage twice before accepting it once, and left for the cottage her uncle no longer lived in, 3 days before the deadline that had governed a stranger's whole spring would pass, uneventfully, without her there to see it arrive. The letters began in June, though neither of them called them that at first, merely notes, the kind exchanged between a household that had once been hers to manage and a woman who had left it in good order. The first concerned a drainage culvert on the eastern boundary, 3 lines long, unsigned save for an initial. She answered with the name of the tenant who ought to oversee its clearing, and a note on the price of gravel, which she happened to remember to the shilling. He did not write again for a fortnight. When he did, it was to say the steward's replacement had found 2 further discrepancies in the old ledgers, matters she had flagged in April and set aside for want of time. She answered at length, the only long letter of the summer, setting out figures in columns as she had once done at his father's desk, and closing with a single line about the weather, which had turned wet again, as though the fields required her opinion on that as well. July brought a letter about hay yields. August, one about a fever that had passed lightly through the tenant cottages and left no one worse for it, which she read twice for what it did not say. She wrote back that her uncle's cottage garden had done well despite the damp, that he had taken in mending work from 3 houses in the village and complained of his eyes, and that neither of them starved. She did not write that she thought of the hall's east wing at dusk, or that she had begun, without deciding to, keeping his letters in the same drawer as her father's old survey books. September came and went in this manner, a note on rents, a note on a widow's roof, a line, once, about a rose that had refused to die, though no one had tended it since spring. The distances between letters lengthened. Neither asked the question the letters were built to avoid. Neither mentioned the 3rd of June, though she marked it privately still, the way one notes the anniversary of a wound long healed, curious only that it no longer ached. Her uncle, watching her fold each letter into her father's Bible before she answered it, said nothing for a long while. Then, one evening in late September, setting down his mending needle, he remarked only that a woman did not keep a man's letters in Scripture unless she meant to keep the man as well, and that she ought to decide, before the year turned, which kind of waiting she intended to go on doing. She did not answer him directly. She only rose the next morning, before the frost had left the grass, and packed the small case she had once carried to Wiltshire in April. Fewer things now, since she had learned what a household would and would not supply, but the same satchel, the same worn Bible, the same coat, mended twice at the elbow since her father last wore it. She told no one the day she meant to go. She had learned, the first time, that arriving unannounced had a clarity that arriving expected did not. The coach let her down at the same crossroads, in the same thin October light, the beaches gone copper where they had been green, the gravel drive longer than she remembered it, or she smaller for having been away. She did not reach the bell. He was already at the door. Not summoned, not warned, he would tell her later, months on, that he had simply taken to watching the drive most evenings since the leaves turned. The way a man watches a gate, he has stopped pretending he does not care to see opened. He came down the steps without his coat, in his shirt sleeves, as if the cold had not occurred to him, and stopped some several feet from her, the distance a man keeps when he intends to let another close it herself. He did not ask what had kept her, nor what had finally moved her. He said only, "You came without writing." "I did," she said. "I found I did not care to ask permission for it." Something in his face loosened then, not a smile exactly, but its quieter cousin, relief, wearing the shape of restraint. He held out his hand, not to lead her in, but simply to take her case, as a man might for a guest he hoped would stay past the season. She let him. That evening, in the room that had once been given her out of obligation, and was now, plainly, given out of wanting, she opened her father's Bible to press a dried violet flat between its pages, and found instead the note already there, torn twice, folded small, kept without her quite remembering when she had put it there for good. She smoothed it once more against the page, the ink still legible, £4,000, or the hand of Miss S. Kendrick, and closed the book over it as one closes a ledger at year's end, the accounts settled, nothing further owed. She had come to Ashworth Hall once to refuse a debt she had never agreed to. She returned to it, this time, for no reason a magistrate or a trustee could have written down. She had been asked, at last, and not told, and that, she found, was the whole of the difference.